He might not have looked it, but the man who wrote Jerusalem was the original rebel artist. William Blake had a visionary imagination that led many of his contemporaries to call him mad. And yet, he was also a man rooted in reality, mixing symbolic images with powerful portraits, full of outrage at the injustices of the world. The prints on display in the Blake Room at Tate Britain plunge you into his unique and strange universe. William Blake was born during the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason, but he spent much of his life railing against the idea that reason should be allowed to dominate human existence. For him, the whole point of life was to open yourself up to the infinite, the divine, the world of the spirits. What really counts is the imagination. And for Blake, the great enemy of the imagination was the spirit of calculation, of cold logic. For him, that was embodied by Newton. And here he shows Newton in this famous colour print, squatting weirdly on the ocean floor, obsessed by his own rationality. And he can't even appreciate the wonderful mottled colours and beauty of the rock on which he sits. When he was a child growing up in London, Blake saw a vision of angels in a tree. And throughout his life, visions were part of his everyday reality.
He was a man out of time. He was living in a romantic, visionary world where he thought that the things inside his head were as important as things in the material universe, which is something that's a belief that I share.
Blake saw himself as a kind of prophet as well as a writer and artist, and that's why he chose to revive an ancient form, that of the hand-illuminated book. He only produced a handful in his lifetime, but they're among the most strange, powerful, wonderful objects in all of British art, and they've got a wonderful collection of them here in the British Museum's Department of Prints and Drawings. This is one of Blake's lesser-known prophetic books. It's called Europe, a Prophecy. Here you've got one of his most famous pictures, The Ancient of Days, and again it expresses beautifully that sense of ambiguity that Blake has towards any authority figure. In this case, God, man's creator, is also perhaps man's jailer. What I also like about this book is the way in which it gives you the two poles between which Blake's imagination oscillates. On the one hand, that grand language of symbolic art squeezed within the pages of a single book. But Blake can travel so easily from that to the problems of his own time. Here we've got this figure in shackles while his horrible lizard-skinned jailer holding a huge key sneaks off up the stairs. It's a brilliant image of Blake's belief that the common people of England did indeed live in chains. Blake was pretty much ignored in his own time, but his combination of political radicalism and visionary ideas made him something of a poster boy for the 60s generation.
Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side.
Blake has a great line in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell about cleansing the doors of perception. It was taken up by Aldous Huxley later, and it seemed to the 60s generation to mean, you know, if you took hallucinogenic drugs, you could cleanse your vision.
William Blake was possibly so far ahead of his time that it took us until the 1960s before we had the faintest idea what he was on about.
He was a man who was not acclaimed in his own lifetime, but he just kept on and on and on, and now, a century later, or 2 centuries later, we recognise what a genius he was.
Now these are the songs of innocence and the songs of experience. Like a lot of people, I expect, I came across this for the first time in English lessons at school, but of course, because we like to keep everything very neat and tidy in our education, I just experienced these poems as words on a printed page. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? And when you see them in the flesh, you see how he uses images, and he uses the whole concept of the illuminated book to set words free from their literal meanings, turning the letters into leaves and tendrils. So it's as if the words are sort of growing out from the limitations of the page. I've got an example here of the block that he would have used to hand print these books. It's a wonderfully touching thing. So you imagine he's just an image no bigger than your hand.
To him, everything was sacred. Everything was exploding with visions. The way that he printed, the techniques that he used, all of these were of immense significance to him.
William Blake had this very strong notion of prophecy, and printmaking was a way of revelation for him. So the prophecies he made were revealed through the print process. Taking the final print, it's the moment of truth. Something is exposed which wasn't seen before. So there's this very mystical and very beautiful process that involved there.
There is something rather magical about the William Blake story. A man neglected in his own time, but ultimately granted a glorious immortality. His reputation was it became like embers. It was kept alive by the circle of his initiates, and they fanned those embers, and gradually, by the 20th century, he'd become this great figure, just from these little images. For me, his work's like a call to arms. Forget shopping and shallow materialism. Blake says, embrace a life of creativity, experiment, imagination. 250 years on, it's a message well worth celebrating.